Hello, my Minnow friends. I'm so glad you've come back for more information on heart attack. I'm giving you an entire unit on heart attack, and it encompasses 26 videos in all. Why so many? Because heart attack is by far the greatest risk for the majority of women, so I'm making sure you know everything. Eventually, I'll give you a whole unit on each and every disease associated with menopause. The heart attack unit is chapter 28 of my book, regardless of whether you have the first edition or the second edition. All of chapter 28. This is video 168, and it's on something called risk calculators for heart attack. Do you know why you should watch this video? Well, if you've ever heard of risk calculators, you should watch it. And if you've ever heard of them but don't know what they are, you should watch it. And if you know what they are but don't know how or why doctors use them, you should watch it. Knowledge is power, and in this case it's minnow power, so just watch it. In the last video, I gave you a long list of risk factors for a heart attack. It consisted of 15 items. Here's the whole list. You learned that each and every one of these things has bearing on your risk for a heart attack. And you learned that some of these factors are more significant for women than others. So the list of risk factors enables you to assess how many of the factors are risks for you. It's great for individualizing both your risk and your management in order to decrease your risk for a heart attack. But in addition to or instead of this list, some doctors use risk calculators. Risk calculators are estimators. They are designed to gauge your chances of having a heart attack. And they're essentially mathematical formulas. They involve filling in your particulars for a few questions and ending up with a score called a risk score. A risk score tells you how likely it is that you will have a heart attack over a certain period of time, usually 10 to 30 years. Doctors use risk calculators to determine who is most likely to benefit from preventive measures like diet, lifestyle, or medications. But the key to these risk calculators is that although you put in your specific information, all you get is a numerical estimate of risk. Now that sounds really nifty, but there are limitations and inadequacies with risk calculators. The first problem is that most people don't understand the meaning of the word risk. Now you know me, I explain everything. Remember, I just said a risk calculator tells you your risk of having a heart attack within a certain period of time. So let's dissect that a bit. Let's say you calculate your risk for a heart attack and the risk calculator gives you a risk of 10%. There are different ways to interpret that 10%. One is the epidemiologic risk. That big word just means that it pertains to the entire population rather than to you individually. So an epidemiologic risk of 10% means that for 100 people with a 10% risk, 10 will have a heart attack over the next decade. So this interpretation of risk may help in planning prevention and treatment for an entire population, but not for you individually. You may or may not be one of the 10 who has a heart attack. 90 of those 100 people will not have a heart attack. The other way to interpret 10% risk is to apply it to yourself personally. In other words, you have a 10% risk of having a heart attack over the next 10 years. But it also means that you have a 90% chance of not having a heart attack over the next 10 years. No risk calculator tells you specifically if you will or won't have a heart attack. They only tell you your probability of having a heart attack. And the long time frame they cover makes people kind of lazy about making changes that will reduce their risk. So let me tell you how risk calculators came about And then I'll tell you about some different risk calculators that are available. In 1992, a study was done in Framingham, Massachusetts. It assessed 5,200 patients to determine their risk for heart attack. Now, while the number 5,200 sounds like a big number, it constitutes only a medium-sized study group. And in devising a numerical risk probability for heart attack, the researchers developed something called the Framingham Risk Score. In the last tutorial, I presented all 15 risk factors for heart attack. Well, the Framingham Risk Score didn't take all 15 into account. Instead, it included only 7 of them. It's been modified twice, once in 2002 and once in 2008, but it still only accounts for about half of the risk factors. And generally speaking, this and other risk calculators tend to underestimate the risk for women, especially those who are at moderate risk. And the women at moderate risk are the very women who can benefit most from intervention. After the Framingham Risk Calculator appeared, others started popping up. One is called the Reynolds Risk Score. Unlike the Framingham Risk Score, it includes family history and markers of inflammation. Another risk calculator is the Atherosclerosis Cardiovascular Disease Risk Assessment Tool, or ASCVD. It's limited to people between the ages of 40 to 75. If you're over 75, too bad. Still another is the Multi-Ethnic Risk Assessment, or MESA, M-E-S-A. And now that technology is so prevalent, you can go online and find all sorts of risk calculators. The problem is that they will all give you different results, some markedly different. I tried it. Here's what I did. I put the same data into 5 different risk calculators. None of the data was extreme. I just made up some values, including all of the following. I used age 59, blood pressure 140/90 on no medications, cholesterol of 220, HDL 40, LDL greater than 130, diabetes type 2, non-smoker, and positive family history. Now, not all the risk calculators asked for all of those pieces of data, but that's the data I used for all of them. And here's what I got. The results were risk scores ranging from 3.4% to 24% for having a heart attack in the next 10 years. I got all of the following scores: 3.4%, 9.1%, 10%, 21.41%, and 24%. So with all these different risk calculators and all their different risk scores, it's really difficult to make much sense out of them. And remember, your doctor may use just one of these risk calculators. Depending on the one he or she uses, it may or may not say you're at risk. So if your doctor uses your risk score to determine whether or not to advise diet and lifestyle changes or whether or not to offer you preventive medicine, it can have a huge impact on your health. Another layer of this involves your insurance. What if your insurance will only approve a lipid-lowering medication if you have a certain threshold risk score? That could keep you from getting what you need. So these risk calculators are nifty, and everyone's thrilled with technological gadgets. But what you really want is to know your actual risk for a heart attack. And all these variable things make it difficult for you to know that. Another problem with risk calculators is that the factors that are most prominent change over time, while the risk calculator stays the same. For instance, when the first risk calculators were developed, type 2 diabetes was extremely rare. But now it's ubiquitous. Even children have type 2 diabetes. And back when the Framingham study took place, smoking was common. Nowadays, it's not nearly as common. Another problem is that while your personal data that you plug into the risk calculator may not change much, You could adopt a much healthier lifestyle and decrease your risk significantly, but the risk calculator may not reflect that. Or you could change doctors and get a completely different risk score simply because he or she uses a different risk calculator. Or your current doctor could start using a different risk calculator too. If you weren't aware of all these nuances, you could be woefully misled in all sorts of ways. Personally, I prefer to know the entire list of risk factors, determine which ones apply to me, and do everything I can to improve them so that I lower my risk for a heart attack. I just think it's important for you to know that these risk calculators exist and that there are many of them, and also that they don't agree with one another in determining your risk. Not only that, the risk score they give you are only a probability. Sometimes it's just better to do things the good old-fashioned way by figuring things out yourself. This sort of reminds me of what it was like when calculators first became available. I'm old. We had to learn how to do all calculations in our heads. I remember memorizing multiplication tables, algebraic expressions, trigonomic identities, calculus derivatives, and all sorts of mathematical things. They're all still in my head to this day. Pi is 3.1416. And when calculators first appeared, we were forbidden to use them. And as a nerd, I've always preferred doing all my mathematical problems the long way. I want to demonstrate every single step. That's part of the fun for me. But over time, everyone had a calculator. And because everyone had one, no one memorized any of these mathematical tables anymore. And school kids were convinced that they would never need to know any math because they'd always have a calculator. I actually heard a young person say exactly that once, and with total conviction. I was appalled. But now hardly anyone does math, and hardly anyone can do math. Just go to the grocery store when the computers are down. The cashier will tell you that you can't buy anything because the computers are down. This has happened to me twice. And both times, I just whipped out cash and said, well, sure I can. And I set the items I was going to buy on the belt. I thought it was no big deal. But both times, the cashiers made a face of total horror. They had absolutely no idea what to do. So I did it for them. I added up the purchase and gave them the cash. And they still had a look of horror because they had no idea how to figure out my change. So I did that for them too. I even showed them how to count back the money to me starting from the purchase total. They just stood there in shock the entire time. Tisk, tisk, tisk. The bottom line is this. Sometimes we're all better off with good old common sense and doing what we know we're supposed to do for our best health. Or I guess you could say that sometimes artificial intelligence breeds natural stupidity. Okie dokie. That sums up our lesson for today. Next week, I'll begin teaching you all the things you can do to lower your risk for a heart attack. I will cover each category of options: diet, lifestyle, vitamins, minerals, and supplements, herbs, hormones, and non-hormonal medications. And I'll do it one video at a time. Be sure to subscribe and follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you need a one-on-one consultation, schedule one at menopausetailor.me. Class dismissed. Bye.